In the late summer of 1929, Palestine experienced its deadliest wave of violence since the First World War. In 11 days, 133 Jews and 116 Arabs were killed in a series of riots fueled by economic stagnation, the growth of the Jewish population through immigration under the aegis of the Zionist movement, a negligent British administration, and the deliberate provocations of an emerging Zionist and Arab nationalist far right. Intercommunal violence between Jews and Arabs had taken place before. It had even happened under the Ottomans, but never on this scale. The country would never be the same. In March 1930, retired Judge Sir Walter Shaw traveled extensively throughout the country, collecting testimony and evidence, and concluded that this had been an unprovoked and unjustified attack by Arabs against Jews at the instigation of Arab nationalist political leaders and by religious leaders who'd harnessed a superficial dispute over the Western Wall to incite the violence. Among those in the know, the implication was clear. Responsibility for the violence lay chiefly with the Grand Mufti Amin al-Husseini, the ceremonial figurehead of Palestine's Muslim community and a well-known agitator who'd frequently used the Arab nationalist cause to further his own family's struggle for power. But thanks to the circumstantial nature of the evidence and his favored position with Palestine's High Commissioner, Husseini was effectively immune from prosecution, and Shaw was careful to avoid implicating him directly. Shaw's report also took aim at Palestine's economic conditions. During the previous several years, a huge wave of Jewish immigration known as the Fourth Aliyah had spurred tremendous economic growth, but also instability. Though the majority of Jews settled in established cities, Jewish purchases of land for farming displaced several thousand Arab tenant farmers, most of whom relocated to the port city of Haifa and took jobs in heavy industry, only to find themselves in an unfavorable position with the mostly Jewish trade unions. If the Fourth Aliyah had grown Palestine's economy, the Arab peasantry weren't well positioned to benefit from it. But the Arab aristocracy and bourgeoisie who did were very well positioned to scapegoat the Jews in a time of economic crisis. A subsequent report by former British MP John Hope Simpson was even more explicit. Fearing a scenario in which economic classes were divided along ethnic lines, the Jewish Congress of Trade Unions, known as the Histadrut, had committed itself to a policy of temporary segregation with some limited collaboration in the belief that it would develop a strong proletariat among both ethnic groups and keep wages from falling. In practice, this policy exacerbated Arab unemployment and fueled radicalization. So under Britain's new left-wing government, Colonial Secretary Baron Passfield issued a white paper clarifying that the 1917 Balfour Declaration should be interpreted as protecting the Arabs' economic rights as well as their legal rights. Henceforth, Jewish immigration would be predicated on Palestine's overall economic situation. Immigration visas would be available to Arabs as well as Jews, and with Jews projected to surpass Arabs as the majority by 1970, the issuing of these visas was regulated to ensure a permanent Arab majority. Jewish land purchases were restricted, and the Jewish Agency for Palestine, the executive arm of the Zionist Congress in Europe, was forbidden from influencing the policies of the Palestinian government. While the Shaw report had emphatically blamed the riots on Arab instigators, it would be irresponsible to ignore the deliberate provocations of the Pro-Wailing Wall Committee, an offshoot of the right-wing Jewish revisionist movement Hatzoar. And the Jewish population didn't ignore it. Hatzoar's leader, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, had been out of the country when the riots broke out and had never given his blessing to the rogue committee. But as the party's founder and figurehead, he took most of the blame. In early 1930, British authorities informed Jabotinsky that High Commissioner John Chancellor had banned him from Palestine. He would spend the rest of his life in exile. Before the riots, the Zionist movement's social democratic parties had struggled with economic recession and political scandal. But the backlash against Hatzoar rallied the Jewish electorate back to their side, and particularly to their leader, David Ben-Gurion. Hastened by the Great Depression, the Social Democrats completed their long-awaited merger into the Palestine Workers' Party, or Mapai, which utterly dominated the following year's elections to the Assembly of Representatives. Though Hatzoar also made significant gains, this had mainly come at the expense of the moderate General Zionists, whose leader Chaim Weizmann had long enjoyed a favored status with Britain's conservative leadership. But with the victory of Ramsay MacDonald's Labour Party, his clout was rapidly fading. In the summer of 1931, the 17th Zionist Congress deposed his ally Frederick Kish as director of the Jewish Agency in favor of the resolutely socialist Chaim Arlozorov, and rejected a proposal to enshrine the establishment of an independent Jewish state as the end goal of the Zionist movement. Thus, Weizmann gave in and enlisted the ascendant Ben-Gurion to negotiate with MacDonald. Though Zionism was a divisive issue within all the major British parties, Labour was ultimately the most supportive. MacDonald had known Mapai's leaders for decades, which is another reason Weizmann had relied on Ben-Gurion to meet with MacDonald at Chequers, the traditional country home of the Prime Minister. Though no formal agreement was made, the meeting effectively nullified Passfield. It also set the stage for serious changes to Palestine's administration. No politician came out of the riots looking worse than High Commissioner Sir John Chancellor, an unapologetic racist who fantasized about exterminating the Yishuv and didn't think highly of the Arabs either. Chancellor had been out of the country when the violence broke out and didn't return until it was nearly over. Despite becoming the most hated man in the country, the need to investigate the massacres and prosecute its perpetrators kept him in Jerusalem. MacDonald's meeting with Ben-Gurion finally put an end to his reign. In his place came General Sir Arthur Grenfell Wauchope, a flamboyant Scottish bachelor who actually liked Palestine and the people who lived there, and used his position to make Jerusalem a party destination for everyone from American athletes to Ethiopian princes. But while Wauchope excelled as Palestine's head of state, he faltered as its head of government. Hot-tempered and domineering, his closeness with MacDonald and disdain for Chancellor led him to overcorrect by giving the major Zionist institutions almost everything they asked for. Under his rule, Jewish immigration surged to levels never seen before. The Fifth Aliyah was in full swing. By the middle of the decade, Palestine's Jewish population was larger than that of Britain or France, and made up more than a quarter of the national population. And though the vast majority of new arrivals settled in Haifa and Tel Aviv, Jewish land purchases in the hinterlands continued apace. In the end, nothing was done to address the underlying causes of the 1929 riots. Wauchope's Zionist sympathies weren't the only reason for the surge in Jewish immigration. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party seized power in Germany and almost immediately began issuing laws to restrict the political and economic rights of German Jews. The reaction across the Jewish world was swift. In March, the American Jewish Congress and Board of Deputies of British Jews agreed to organize an economic boycott of Germany. And while many Jewish organizations were apprehensive, the speed at which the Nazis were implementing anti-Jewish laws convinced them to join in. By late spring, the boycott movement had spread to Jewish communities around the world, including the Yishuv. The Nazis' consolidation of power also sparked a mass exodus, with nearly 40,000 Jews fleeing Germany in 1933 alone. Zionism had never been popular in Germany. Most German Jewish refugees resettled in other Western European countries, yet even most who came to Palestine weren't avowed Zionists, which may be why most of them settled in majority Arab Haifa rather than Tel Aviv. Nevertheless, the Jewish Agency saw the sudden influx of young, educated professionals and skilled workers as an opportunity to strengthen their position against the Arab nationalists. Their situation still wasn't ideal. Back in 1931, Germany's pre-Nazi government had instituted a flight tax to stop wealthy Germans from taking their money out of the country in the midst of the Depression. But once the Nazis came to power, they began abusing the tax to extort Jews fleeing the country, irrespective of wealth, a practice that was formalized in 1934. The impact on the Yishuv was twofold. Not only was the flight tax discouraging German Jews from fleeing, but those who did arrived penniless. Of course, the only way to remedy this would be for the Jewish Agency to negotiate with the Nazi government, which was politically untenable. But in April, when the first anti-Jewish laws were being issued, one Sam Cohen of the Netanya-based Hanotea Citrus Company had taken the initiative and unilaterally signed an agreement with the German Ministry of Finance to break the anti-Nazi boycott by selling German farm equipment in Palestine in exchange for the transfer of 1 million marks in German Jewish assets. Horrified that a private business was conducting diplomacy behind their backs, the Jewish Agency under Arlozorov was compelled to take control of the situation, even if that meant negotiating with the Nazis. Of course, it was Wauchope, not the Jewish Agency, who had the constitutional authority to conduct diplomacy. But given his Zionist sympathies and anti-fascist politics, he wasn't about to stop them. As luck would have it, the German consul in Jerusalem was Heinrich Wolf, a pre-Nazi appointee who was married to a Jewish woman and had thus far evaded the Nazis' purge of the civil service. Through him, negotiations began in June. Under the Haavara, or transfer agreement, German Jews could deposit up to 50,000 marks at the Reichsbank for transfer to the Anglo-Palestine Bank in exchange for a £1,000 deposit with the Palestinian Office of Customs and Revenue, the necessary amount for immigrants to bypass Palestine's annual immigration quota. The Ministry of Economics didn't agree to this plan out of any love for Zionism, nor even a desire to hasten the decline of Germany's Jewish population. If they wanted that, they would have abolished the flight tax. Rather, the ministry was motivated by fear that the ongoing boycott might escalate to an embargo by Britain and the US. Nazi observers at the consulate wildly overestimated Jerusalem's influence over the global Jewish population, and believed that puncturing the boycott through the Anglo-Palestine Bank would bring it to a swift end worldwide. Though Wolf's principles put him at odds with the Nazis, he was painfully naive to their true intentions, and supported their conclusion in the mistaken belief that it would lessen the tension between Nazis and Jews. But far from ending the boycott worldwide, the Haavara Agreement didn't even end it in Palestine. Boycotts are by nature voluntary, so the vast majority of the Yishuv simply kept doing it. It also did less than expected to facilitate Jewish immigration to Palestine. Between 1933 and 1939, only a quarter of Jewish arrivals did so through the agreed process, often as transients seeking to resettle in a third country. Berlin firmly rejected Wolf's proposals to expand the agreement, and in 1935 he was fired in accordance with the Nuremberg laws. By that point, the Nazi Party had become bitterly divided over whether to continue allowing Jews to flee Germany or to prevent them from leaving in order to use them as hostages. Ultimately, German leader Adolf Hitler chose to continue allowing emigration, though the idea of hostage diplomacy didn't disappear. As the situation in Germany became more desperate, Berlin repeatedly renegotiated the Haavara Agreement with the goal of ending the boycott by forcing the Anglo-Palestine Bank to purchase German goods. But this effort failed, and by 1936, the Nazis had concluded that their efforts would be better served securing an economic alliance with Palestine's Arab population in opposition to the Zionists. The agreement remained in place, but it played a marginal role due to mounting opposition within the Nazi cabinet. Opposition to the agreement was widespread in the Yishuv, but in an increasingly polarized landscape, the debate took on a partisan character. Mapai, by way of Arlosorov, argued that helping fellow Jews escape Nazi persecution was simply the right thing to do, with the added benefit that they would strengthen the Zionist position in Palestinian politics. By contrast, Ze'ev Jabotinsky's Hatzoar opposed any dealings with Germany. Jabotinsky agreed with Arlosorov's motivations, but rejected the notion that it was necessary to negotiate with the Nazis. You want to rescue German Jews and bring them here? Do it illegally. Sneak them out of the country and land them on the beach in the dead of night. Jabotinsky was in an impossible position. Throughout Hatzoar's existence, Ben-Gurion privately decried it as a band of fascist thugs, and not without reason. Jabotinsky wasn't a fascist, but as the lone standard-bearer for the Zionist right, many of his younger followers were. And with Jabotinsky in exile, it was impossible to keep them in line. In April 1931, Avraham Tromi led a mutiny against the official Zionist paramilitary known as the Haganah to form the rival National Military Organization, or Etzel. Like Jabotinsky, the Etzel weren't fascist, but many of its members were, and the organization as a whole rejected the Haganah's collaboration with British authorities, as well as its commitment to defensive restraint in the face of Arab nationalist terrorism, without Jabotinsky's blessing and against his wishes. And those who believed the Etzel hadn't gone far enough were welcomed into the overtly fascist Brit HaBiryonim, led by journalist Abba Achimeir. Though the Haavara Agreement wasn't formally reached until August 1933, the negotiations ended in June, at which point Arlosorov returned to Tel Aviv. On the night of the 16th, he was walking along the beach with his wife when he was confronted by two young men and fatally shot. The main suspects in the murder were two of Achimeir's disciples, Avraham Stavsky and Zvi Rosenblatt. A week earlier, Achimeir himself had published one of many opinion pieces in the right-wing newspaper Chazit Ha'am condemning Arlosorov as a money-grubbing opportunist who'd stabbed the Jewish people in the back, leading to his indictment as a co-conspirator, though the charges were dropped for want of hard evidence. At trial a year later, Rosenblatt was acquitted, as the prosecution couldn't prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but Stavsky was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was acquitted on appeal, but the Supreme Court noted that this was mainly due to Palestine's unusual requirement for witness testimony to be corroborated. Had the trial taken place under English law, the court stated, his conviction would have been upheld. But Hatzoar took it as a win, setting the stage for a bitter debate between right and left over the line between resistance and collaboration that would continue uninterrupted for the next 25 years. Jabotinsky's attempts to distance himself from fascism weren't helped by his deepening relationship with Italy's fascist prime minister Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was the original fascist, having seized power in 1922, and his brand of fascism was pretty distinct from that of Hitler. Fascism is fundamentally an authoritarian nationalist movement, and as such will take on unique characteristics in each nation. In Germany, anti-Semitism had deep roots in nationalism in the form of Völkism, but in Italy, the cause of Jewish emancipation had been a key component of the struggle for unification and independence, so anti-Semitism didn't factor into Italian fascism. The Italian Fascist Party had Jewish members, and Abba Achimer even argued that the Nazis had corrupted fascism by incorporating anti-Semitism. But if Jabotinsky wasn't a fascist, he was an Italophile. He recognized the historic ties between Italy and the Jewish people, and shared Mussolini's vision of a common Mediterranean civilization under threat from the corrosive influence of Germanic chauvinism, which Jabotinsky tied not only to Nazism, but also the British Empire. In the 1920s, Mussolini had opposed Zionism, instead pursuing an alliance between Italy and the greater Arab world. But as Italy's continued dominion over Libya made that alliance impossible, he pivoted to Zionism. For Mussolini, who'd made his name by opposing liberal multilateralism, Hatzoar's deepening isolation from the Zionist mainstream was a feature, not a bug. So in 1933, the Italian Foreign Ministry issued internal memoranda stating that the establishment of an independent, majority Jewish state in Palestine was in Italy's best interest. This was a bigger deal than it might seem. Throughout the interwar period, most Zionist politicians were undecided on what independence would even look like. Some, known as binationalists, were content to live in a majority Arab state so long as the Jewish right of return was respected. A subset of this group even argued for Palestine to be incorporated into a pan-Levantine federation stretching from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. The loudest voice for a Jewish state was Jabotinsky, who envisioned a republic on both sides of the Jordan in which Jews and Arabs would be equal in all respects, but Jews would be the majority. So for Italy to incorporate this idea into their foreign policy was a milestone for the Zionist right. And if fascist Italy was the only country to take Hatzoar's side, they would accept it, optics be damned. For unknown reasons, relations between Jabotinsky and Mussolini never advanced beyond this point, but in 1934, Jabotinsky was able to establish a naval academy in Civitavecchia for Hatzoar's youth movement Betar. The revisionist quest for international support only hastened their alienation. At the 19th Zionist Congress in Lucerne, an emboldened Jabotinsky renewed his call for a resolution supporting an independent Jewish state, but was again voted down. In protest, Hatzoar withdrew from the Zionist Congress and the Histadrut and established the new Zionist organization in Paris. It received no recognition and was financially insolvent, but the revisionist boycott of Zionist institutions would continue for the next 11 years. The Etzel continued operating under Tromi, but with no authority or legitimacy. In the eyes of the British, the Arabs, and the Haganah, they were terrorists. In 1931, it seemed like Grand Mufti Amin al-Husseini had gotten everything he wanted. He'd avoided prosecution for his role in the 1929 riots and had emerged from the violence as Palestine's only Arab nationalist leader of note. A big fish in a shrinking pond. Ironically, Wauchope's total failure to heed the recommendations of the Shaw or Hope Simpson reports totally undid that perception. Far from carrying the torch of Arab Palestine, the mindless struggle between the Husseini and Nashashibi families had only served to marginalize and immiserate a poor and disenfranchised public. So other Arab leaders rushed to fill the gap. At the same time Haifa was filling with refugees fleeing the Nazis, it was also filling with young Arabs who'd come from the countryside looking for work in shipping and heavy industry. At the very least, Wauchope had rejected the Histadrut's argument that the city's Jewish dock workers required a higher minimum wage than their Arab counterparts, comparing it to the discrimination he'd once witnessed in South Africa. But it was little comfort to Arab workers, who remained mostly unorganized and often unemployed. Far removed from the entrenched aristocracy in Jerusalem, Haifa became the perfect incubator for new Arab nationalist movements. In August 1932, historian Izzat Darwaza founded the Independence Party. Whereas Arab leadership in the past had been hopelessly Jerusalem-centric, most of the new party's founders were from Nablus, with Haifa as their main base of support. They modeled themselves on the Indian National Congress, rejecting the aristocratic squabbles of the past in favor of a movement of workers and farmers with an emphasis on organized labor, a policy shared by the mostly Jewish but anti-Zionist Palestine Communist Party. But, as with Hatzoar, there were those within the party who rejected peaceful means, and received less than universal condemnation for it. A native of northern Syria, Imam Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam had taken refuge in Haifa when the French seized control of Aleppo, working as a teacher at the Jureina and coincidentally named Independence mosques. A deeply conservative Islamist, Qassam condemned many of Palestine's local Islamic traditions, but his openness to the public endeared him to many of the city's new arrivals, as well as the Grand Mufti, who appointed him as a jurist. Qassam was also an unapologetic advocate for religious violence. By 1930, he'd established the Black Hand, an organization of several hundred operatives, mostly teenage boys in Haifa and the Jezreel Valley, plus a handful of volunteers from Iraq. In April 1931, the Black Hand announced itself by ambushing and killing 3 Jewish residents at the kibbutz of Yagur, followed by a scattered attack on multiple settlements in early 1932 and a bombing in Naalal that December. All the while, the Black Hand targeted infrastructure, sabotaging railways and burning trees planted by the Jewish National Fund as part of their reforestation effort. Both Qassam and the Independence Party were constantly undermined by Husseini. Qassam was surprised when his boss denied him funds to buy weapons under the guise of repairing the Independence Mosque, and was again surprised when Husseini denied his invitation to call for a national jihad. Instead, in October 1933, the Husseini-led Arab Executive Committee seized the initiative by announcing a general strike in Jerusalem, in defiance of the ban on public protests that had been in place since 1929. The demonstrations resulted in some violence between protesters and police, but the event was mostly peaceful and resulted in no deaths. What's more, the police were willing to negotiate for limited demonstrations that wouldn't face legal repercussions, encouraging the AEC to repeat them 2 weeks later in Jaffa. There, a radical faction of several thousand broke from the main crowd and rushed the police, who responded by charging. In the ensuing riot, 15 demonstrators and 2 police officers were killed, including a 6-year-old boy felled by a stray bullet. News of the incident, and a fair amount of misinformation, spread across the country. In Haifa, demonstrators gathered around the Independence Mosque and the main train station, attacking police and passing vehicles. Though this riot continued into the following day, only 4 people were killed, all demonstrators. The Palestine Communist Party made a feeble attempt to reignite the riot, but failed. In Nablus, 1 demonstrator was killed before the crowd was dispersed, and in Jerusalem the demonstrations continued for 2 days, but without any fatalities. In the end, the riots only proved that the Arab nationalists could organize a coordinated resistance. David Ben-Gurion was awed. But no single faction had proven its ability to harness that power effectively. Not the Husseinis, not the Independence Party, certainly not the Communists, and not even Qassam. While both the Yishuv and the Arab nationalists contended with unprecedented divisions, not all was lost. For all the chaos being sowed on the Jewish right, David Ben-Gurion's Mapai remained the most popular party by far, and enjoyed good relations with Wauchope. And on the 20th of March 1934, Ben-Gurion met with a man who, at that moment, enjoyed more political legitimacy than any other Arab leader. The Cambridge-educated son of a popular Jerusalem mayor, Musa Alami had served as Wauchope's private secretary until his recent promotion to Assistant Attorney General. He'd married into the Husseini clan, but he wasn't on good terms with them due to his natural charisma, British education, often arrogant demeanor, and willingness to negotiate with the Yishuv in good faith. He later lamented that the Arabs never produced a Ben-Gurion of their own. I believe they did. Ben-Gurion was never very well informed when it came to the Arabs, but he was serious about reconciliation, even after the rest of his party had given up on it. Like most of Mapai, Ben-Gurion had spent the 1920s under the assumption that Arab anti-Zionism was a form of class warfare, organized by the Arab aristocracy and bourgeoisie to prevent the development of an empowered working class. And there was an element of truth to this, which is why he'd advocated for a separate but collaborative alliance between Jewish and Arab workers that would endear the latter to the virtues of Zionism. But since the violence of 1929, his perspective had changed. Many Jews, traumatized by the events of that year, gave in to hate and the desire for revenge. But Ben-Gurion refused to be one of them. Whatever his misunderstandings, his prejudices, or his ambitions, he committed himself to empathy, if not necessarily sympathy. At last, he was convinced that Arab nationalism was sincerely felt by the proletariat, and it wasn't his place to deny their right to self-determination any more than it was theirs to deny it to the Jews. In 1931, against the wishes of his party, Ben-Gurion published We and Our Neighbors, in which he outlined his immediate vision to reform Palestine into a binational federation. British authority would be minimized to matters of the military, justice, and infrastructure. Jewish settlement would continue in the places where it already existed, but would extend no further. Both the Jewish and Arab populations would be entitled to devolved forms of government, but in all other respects, politically, religiously, and economically, they would be equal citizens. This was only Ben-Gurion's vision for Palestine's future as a British mandate. For the sake of his party, and the need to be flexible in future negotiations, he'd carefully avoided outlining a vision for the post-Zionist order. But by 1934, the surge of Jewish immigration provoked by the rise of the Nazis had convinced him that the Yishuv was finally in a strong enough position to begin negotiating. Unlike any self-declared nationalist leader, Alami had real power to effect constitutional change. He and Ben-Gurion had the utmost respect for each other, and if negotiations failed, Ben-Gurion reasoned that Jewish immigration would continue as it had, strengthening the Yishuv's position further and forcing Alami back to the table.
We bring a blessing to the Arabs of Palestine, and they have no good cause to oppose us.
I would prefer that the country remain impoverished and barren for another 100 years, until we ourselves are able to develop it on our own.
By the evening's end, a basic framework had been agreed. Once the British were gone, Palestine would become just one part of an Arab federation extending from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. That way, Palestine's Arabs would no longer have to fear becoming a minority in their own country, and Jewish immigration could continue. Since Arabs currently made up 77% of Palestine's population, Alami wouldn't accept communal parity in a future parliament, but Jewish fears of being shut out of government would be eased with a constitutional mandate to include Arab and Jewish ministers in the cabinet. By 1974, Jewish immigration would top out at 4 million. Jews would still be allowed to buy farmland on the coastal plain between Tel Aviv and Atlit, but there would be no more evictions. Over the next several months, Alami became preoccupied with his role as prosecutor in the Arlozorov murder trial, followed by a prolonged illness. In the meantime, Ben-Gurion began presenting their plan to Arab politicians in both Palestine and Lebanon. Many questions remained unanswered. Would the Transjordan rejoin Palestine or continue as its own province? How would Syria and Lebanon join the federation when their French mandatories had no intention of letting them go? And what of Iraq, whose government's pan-Arab ambitions seemed to die with King Faisal? Alami feared that any one of these questions could undo everything, but Wauchope was encouraged and urged them to keep going. In August, Alami called Ben-Gurion with shocking news. Grand Mufti Husseini was willing to negotiate, so long as the negotiations were publicized. He claimed disbelief at the idea that any Jews sought understanding with Arabs, and indeed most of Mapai was horrified by the thought of their own leader sitting down with the instigator of the 1929 pogroms. But Beryl Katznelson, who had founded the Histadrut with Ben-Gurion, persuaded the party that it was the moral thing to do, alluding to the justifications by which they'd allowed the Haavara Agreement. Ben-Gurion arrived for negotiations in Geneva, but not with Husseini. Instead, the talks involved two surrogates. After 3 hours of discussion, they told Ben-Gurion that his ideas were stupid, arrogant, and unrealistic. The Jews, they said, had nothing to offer the Arab people, and would be better off fighting a war against them than trying to work together. Even if the Jews somehow managed to establish an independent state, they would never recognize it. Though Ben-Gurion was slow to realize it, Husseini had only agreed to negotiate so he could say he'd tried and failed. And by insisting on transparency, he'd authorized his surrogates to humiliate Ben-Gurion and Alami in their magazine La Nation Arabe. They even pretended to forget Ben-Gurion's name. If Ben-Gurion had been content to continue working with Alami, this could have been avoided. But his insistence on treating the Mufti as the ultimate figurehead of Palestinian Arabs had totally backfired. The way forward was shut. Ben-Gurion and Alami remained friends for the rest of their lives. Just over a year later, dock workers in Jaffa were unloading a cargo of cement mix bound for Tel Aviv when one of the barrels gave out, revealing not only cement mix, but guns and ammunition. A subsequent inspection by the Port Authority revealed that most of the barrels contained surplus weapons from the First World War: 25 Lewis guns, 800 rifles, and 400,000 rounds of ammunition. Since the intended recipient had used a fake name, no suspect was found, but it was almost certainly the work of the Haganah. Given their deepening connections with the British, it's possible that the Haganah had intended these weapons for use in a counterinsurgency against the Etzel. But Arab nationalists justifiably interpreted it as a threat against themselves and called for another general strike while Qassam renewed the Black Hands attacks in the north. When his men killed a police officer in a shootout, the authorities began to close in. 10 days later, they found Qassam hiding in a cave near the town of Yabad. A shootout ensued, and he was shot dead. Ben-Gurion reacted to this news with utter dread. Had Qassam been taken alive, he may well have faded into obscurity. But in death, the Arab movement had gained a legendary martyr, just as the Zionists had with Trumpeldor 15 years earlier. His fears were confirmed 5 days later when Wauchope received a list of demands: an end to all Jewish immigration, an end to all Jewish land purchases, and the immediate establishment of an elected parliament. The demands had come from a joint delegation of Darwaza's Independence Party, Nashashibi's National Defense Party, and Husseini's Palestine Arab Party. Not only had Qassam's death eliminated one of Husseini's rivals, but he could now wield Qassam's legacy to rally the nationalist movement around him. And Ben-Gurion had every reason to believe that Britain's recent elections would compel Westminster to accept their demands. All the while, the refugees from Germany kept coming, the Etzel continued its terrorist activity, and the hope once shared by Ben-Gurion and Alami became a distant memory. This was no longer a constitutional crisis. It was no longer a diplomatic impasse. It was the brink of civil war. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, David Ben Yosef, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, Dr. Chike, Andrew Ettinger, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osha Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Milk and Honey, Xander Montgomery, David Safarian, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.